Welcome everybody to the last Garrod seminar here in Cambridge of the Michaelmas term. Thank you for attending, and just looking forward, continue please to watch this space because we have a very full program being built for our Garrods for January to March, where the theme will be decolonization, and we'll have a series of exciting speakers and panels and such like to which to look forward. Those of you who are members of staff here in the department will know that our departmental meeting ended about 1 to 2 minutes ago. Kat very wisely parachuted out about 10 minutes to get herself ready. I was unable to because I was chairing it, and that means that the vital 10 minutes to produce the usual flowery encomium on the speaker that I would expect to produce didn't quite happen. So my apologies for that, and I hope whatever this introduction lacks in floweriness will be made up for in terms of sincerity. As you all know, one of the most exciting things about this department over the last few years has been the ability to appoint a series of outstanding new generation appointments in many fields, but particularly focusing in biological anthropology and in human evolution. And over previous weeks, we've heard 2 of those speakers present on their work. And today we have one further star appointment in the form of Kathelijne Koops, who will be speaking to us today on her research. What I would like to just emphasize is Kat is another of these globe-trotting international stars. She began in Utrecht, came to Cambridge to do her doctoral work, then took up a research position in Zurich, and we were again fortunate, very grateful to be able to entice her back to our advertised tutorship in primatology here at Cambridge. The subject she's offering us is of apes and tools, insights into the evolution of technology. A marvelous subject about which we look forward to hearing from you. Kat, over to you and thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyprian, and happy Thanksgiving to all. It's my great pleasure to be speaking to you today in the Department of Archaeology's Garrod Seminar Series. And I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about my research of apes and tools. And I hope to convince you that by studying ape tool use, we can in turn shed light on the evolution of technology. Now, first, I will talk about my research on chimpanzees. Then we will dive into my comparative work on chimpanzees and bonobos. And lastly, I will introduce you to ongoing and upcoming research across all the African apes and humans. But first, how did it all begin? The oldest known hominid stone tool dates to about 3.3 million years ago and was found in West Turkana in Kenya. Over millions of years, technology evolved from these simple stone tools to more elaborate bifaces, spear points, bows and arrows, needles, and pottery, all the way to the complex technology we have today, which includes things like spaceships. Across the globe, we see an amazing spectrum of cultural diversity with different peoples using different technologies. And these technologies have helped humans spread all over the world into places ranging from the Arctic to the desert to the rainforest. Technology is a defining feature of our species. Humans are the only species dependent on technology for their survival. And the question, what makes humans such unique technological beings, is akin to asking the fundamental question, what makes us human? My central research question, therefore, is what drives the evolution of technology? Now, unfortunately, we don't have a time machine to study the use of tools by our hominin ancestors, but we do have the next best thing, our closest living relatives, the great apes. So where fossils are silent, studies of living apes are essential for understanding how and why hominin behavior changed since our lineage split from that of the other apes. The African apes are genetically most closely related to us, and chimpanzees and bonobos are our closest living relatives. So by studying them, we can discover what distinguishes humanity from its ape-like ancestors. Chimpanzees are especially informative with regards to the evolution of technology, since they use a wide variety of tools across a range of contexts, just like we do. For example, some chimpanzee groups crack nuts. Here you see JJ, an adult male, and he's using a stone, hammer, and anvil to crack open oil palm nuts. Other chimpanzee groups dip for army ants. Here we see Guy, an adult female, and she's using a long stick to harvest these aggressive ants from their underground nest. So what we see is that different chimpanzee groups, called communities, use different types of tools. And interestingly, some groups use more tool types than others. These differences in tool-use behaviors were found to be cultural. We primatologists term behavioral variants cultural if they are group typical and depend on social learning for their transmission. Now, a lot of research went into figuring out whether chimpanzees and other non-human species indeed do have culture. First, by showing that behavioral variation across populations cannot simply be chalked up to environmental or genetic differences between sites. And second, by using experimental research in captivity to confirm that social learning processes are indeed involved in the acquisition of tool use. Now, how about tool use in the other primates? As we saw, humans are the ultimate tool-using ape, and among the non-human apes, diverse tool use is found in wild chimpanzees and to a lesser extent in orangutans. In wild gorillas, evidence for tool use is almost absent and restricted to just a few anecdotes of stick use for postural support. Similarly, tool use in wild bonobos is rare and absent in food acquisition. However, bonobos are capable of making and using tools in captivity. More recently, tool use has been reported in two species of monkeys, bearded capuchin monkeys and long-tailed macaques. Now, the big question, of course, is what explains these differences in primate tool use? The original model of primate tool use suggested that cognition, which includes learning and insight, influences the invention and transmission of tool use. Sociality, which includes tolerance and gregariousness, was further proposed to influence tool use transmission and retention. But there's no mention of the potential influence of the environment. Hence, I set out to fill this gap and address exactly this. How does the environment influence tool use and thus culture? And further, how do the environment's sociality and cognition work together to drive primate tool use and material culture? So this brings us to the roadmap of my talk. To shed light on the big question, what drives the evolution of technology, I study apes across Africa. First, I will talk about my work on the role of the environment in driving tool use at my study site in the Nimba Mountains in Guinea, West Africa. And I will also introduce you to some other exciting non-tool use related research projects at Nimba. Then second, I will talk about my comparative research on chimpanzees and bonobos, our two closest living relatives, one of which, the chimpanzee, uses a range of foraging tools, and the other, the bonobo, doesn't. So this dramatic difference in the use of technology makes the species comparison ideal for examining the roles of the environment's sociality and cognition. And then lastly, I will introduce you to my current research, which includes all the African apes as well as humans, all living in the Congo Basin forest. So this will be the roadmap for my talk today, and it will appear throughout to help you stay on track as we move through the different sections. So let's start off with the research on chimpanzee technology in West Africa. I will first introduce you to my chimpanzee study site in the Nimba Mountains in Guinea. Nimba is the only montane chimpanzee study site in West Africa, and this extreme environment makes it an ideal place to study tool use diversity in this highly flexible and adaptable species. I first started studying the Nimba chimpanzees in 2003, so that's over 17 years ago now. And this is what the Nimba team looked like in the early days, and this is what the team looked like a decade later. Currently, our Guinean collaborators are continuing to monitor the chimpanzees and other wildlife whilst taking all the necessary COVID safety precautions. And these are some of the chimpanzees. Our research focuses on 2 communities at the study site. And at Nimba, we use 3 ways of collecting data. We conduct behavioral observations of the chimpanzees when possible. These chimpanzees are only partly habituated to the presence of researchers, so we cannot rely exclusively on direct observations for our data collection. We also use motion-triggered camera traps, which is a great way of obtaining data without researchers being present. And we study indirect evidence, such as the tools the chimpanzees leave behind. Now, before we dive into the tool use findings from Nimba, I would like to highlight some exciting recent and ongoing research projects. Firstly, I will introduce you to the first ever findings of trap fishing by chimpanzees. Next, we'll have a look at exciting new work on buttress drumming. And thirdly, I will tell you about work on chimpanzee sociality and grouping patterns at Nimba. First, crab fishing. We discovered that Nimba chimpanzees eat freshwater crabs. This is the first record of a non-human ape consuming crabs and the first evidence of chimpanzees eating aquatic fauna. And as you can see here, the chimpanzees search for crabs in these shallow watercourses by using their fingers to disturb the stream bed. Crab fishing is often a group activity. Here we see an adult female on the right. She's busy fishing for crabs, whilst her kiddo up on the tree there is having a great time playing around. So what did we find? The chimpanzees fished for crabs year-round, and this was not related to the availability of fruit. Interestingly, crab fishing is done most and for the longest durations by females and their offspring. And nutritional analyses show that crabs are high in salt and calcium and may be an important source of these micronutrients. Now, these findings on crab fishing in chimpanzees, they can contribute to our understanding of aquatic faunifery in hominins. First, our findings suggest that consumption of aquatic fauna can occur in closed forests in addition to open wetlands. Second, aquatic fauna could have been a staple part of hominin diets rather than a seasonal fallback route. And third, consumption of aquatic fauna could have been especially important for females and their immature offspring. Now at Nimba, we are currently very interested in looking at how young chimpanzees learn to eat crabs and why not all communities in Nimba fish for crabs. So let's now have a look at buttress drumming. This was an adult male in Nimba drumming on this huge buttressed tree. This is research by my PhD student, Megan Fitzgerald, and she is interested in finding out whether chimpanzees are selective as to which trees and which buttresses they drum on in order to shed light on the function of buttress drumming. By comparing trees used for drumming with unused trees, she found that yes, chimpanzees prefer certain tree species. They prefer bigger trees and trees with more buttresses. And secondly, yes, chimpanzees prefer buttresses that are thinner and have a larger surface area. So these findings show very clear selectivity in both buttress drumming tree choice and in buttress choice. The preference for these more resonant substrates, so the larger and thinner buttresses, supports the proposed function of drumming in long-distance communication. Next, chimpanzee sociality. Here we see a chimpanzee traveling party or a subgroup. Chimpanzees live in a fission fusion society where community members form these temporary parties that frequently change in size and composition. Here we have a number of adult females with their offspring. And as you can see, motion-triggered cameras give us a really unique look into the lives of these wild chimpanzees. My then master student, Kelly van Leeuwen, was interested in finding out the best methods to measure chimpanzee party size. So she set out to compare 3 different measures: direct observations, nest counts, so these are the beds that chimpanzees make to sleep in at night, and motion-triggered cameras. And what Kelly found was that motion-triggered cameras best represented chimpanzee party size and most accurately reflected the effects of socio-ecological factors such as food abundance and the presence of estrus females. Motion-triggered cameras show that the more food and the more estrus females there are, the bigger the parties. So these findings really highlight the exciting potential of using these motion-triggered cameras to study unhabituated chimpanzees. And you really could say that this new technology is a game changer. Okay, after this little excursion, we will now get back to today's seminar topic, which is tool use. Now, what types of tools do we find in Nimba? A few years ago now, we discovered a new type of tool use called Trichulia fracturing. Trichulia fracturing is a form of percussive technology, and it involves the use of stone and wooden cleavers to open up the large and fibrous fruits of Trichulia africana. Here you see the stone cleaver and the fractured fruit on the right. The second type of tool use in Nimba is end dipping. We discovered that the chimpanzees were selective regarding the species of plants they used to make tools. We also found that they used 2 different types of end dipping tools, a tool set consisting of an end dipping and a digging tool. And here you see the 2 types of tools left behind in an ant nest. However, chimpanzees in Nimba do not crack nuts, nor do they fish for termites. And the absence of nut cracking is especially surprising since the close-by chimpanzees in Bosu are highly dependent on nut cracking for subsistence. Now remember, my main research question in Nimba with regards to technology was, how does the environment influence tool use? To assess whether and how the environment influences tool use in chimpanzees, I tested 2 non-mutually exclusive hypotheses. The opportunity hypothesis states that encounter rates with resources may determine the use of foraging tools, whereas the necessity hypothesis states that foraging tool use is a response to the scarcity of preferred foods, which in the case of chimpanzees is ripe fruit. To test the opportunity hypothesis, I assessed the opportunities for chimpanzees to encounter food sources requiring tool use. Here we have a very schematic version of the study site. And what I found was that, first of all, chimpanzees preferred to range at high altitudes. Secondly, nut trees and termites were rare and were found mainly at low altitudes. And thirdly, army ants were abundant and occurred mainly at high altitudes, just like the chimpanzees. Hence, the presence of ant dipping and the absence of termite fishing and nut cracking could be explained by the opportunities to encounter these resources. To test the necessity hypothesis, I looked at the relationship between tool use in ant dipping and the availability of ripe fruit, the chimpanzees' preferred food. And here we see fruit availability on the x-axis and the proportion of species with ants as a proxy for ant dipping on the y-axis. And as you can see, there is no correlation between fruit availability and ant consumption. So to sum up, tool use at Nimba could indeed be explained by the opportunities to encounter specific food sources, whereas low fruit availability did not lead to more tool use. So these findings suggest that ecological opportunity, rather than necessity, may be the mother of invention. In fact, findings on 3 species of tool-using primates, chimpanzees, capuchins, and orangutans show that the ecological opportunities to encounter resources requiring tool use are key in explaining tool use patterns. Hence, we can revise the original model and we can add an explicit role for the environment. Next, I developed a research design to determine the relative importance of these 3 factors. This brings us to the second part of my talk. We'll now have a look at my comparative research on chimpanzees and bonobos to look at the roles of the environment, sociality, and cognition. For this, I studied chimpanzees at Kalinzu in Uganda and bonobos at Wamba in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chimpanzees and bonobos are equally closely related to us, yet they differ drastically in their use of technology. Chimpanzees are renowned for their extensive use of foraging tools, whereas bonobos use few tools in the wild and none in foraging. Now, to investigate what explained this tool use difference, I examined the roles of ecological, social, and cognitive factors. First, I measured the ecological opportunities in terms of insect and nut availability for both chimpanzees at Kalinzu and bonobos at Wamba. To illustrate the findings for the bonobos, here we have the bonobo follows at Wamba for the 2 communities that I studied, and the yellow dots indicate army ant encounters. And you can see that army ants occur across the bonobo ranges. Similarly, Macrothermes termite mounds, the green dots, were found across the 2 home ranges. Hence, ecological opportunities in terms of insect and nut availability could not explain the difference in tool use between chimpanzees and bonobos. Bonobos really had plentiful opportunities to use tools. Second, I looked at the social opportunities in terms of the number of social partners and feeding proximity to others. First, the number of social partners gives an indication of the number of possible models to learn from. Here we have chimpanzees in blue and bonobos in red, and the mean number of social partners on the y-axis. And what we see is that young bonobos have more social partners than young chimpanzees from whom to potentially learn. Next, feeding in close proximity to others provides a more direct way to assess learning opportunities in the relevant context of feeding. Here we have the proportion of time feeding in close proximity on the y-axis. And what we see is that young bonobos spend more time feeding close to others than young chimpanzees, and they therefore have more opportunities to learn feeding skills from others. So what we would predict based on social opportunities is that bonobos would use more tools than chimpanzees, but they don't. Hence, social opportunities could not explain the species difference in tool use. Third, we assessed a potential difference in the predisposition for tool use by comparing object manipulation in young chimpanzees and bonobos. Object manipulation changes from non-goal directed exploration of sticks or leaves into goal-directed tool use, such as hand dipping or leaf sponging, as chimpanzees mature. So object manipulation can be considered the developmental precursor of tool use. Now, what does this look like? Here you see an example of chimpanzee object manipulation. This is a 7-year-old female chimpanzee named Iku, and she is making a probing tool to investigate a hole in a dead tree. Some of the object manipulation by immatures is actual tool use, but most of it involves behaviors like exploring, carrying, breaking, or playing with objects. Here we have another example of chimpanzee object manipulation. This is Ayu, a 3-year-old female behind there, and Mugisha, a 1-year-old male, and they're playing together with a leaf. And we call this social object play. And here we have an example of bonobo object manipulation. This is a 1.5-year-old bonobo called Seiko, and he is having a wonderful time playing with a twig. And we call this solitary object play. So what did I find? Here we see object manipulation rates on the y-axis at different ages on the x-axis in the two species, chimpanzees in blue and bonobos in red. And what we see is, as predicted, higher rates of object manipulation in chimpanzees as compared to bonobos. And strikingly, this difference is already clear at a very young age, suggesting an innate predisposition rather than a learned interest in objects. Hence, the predisposition to interact with objects did play an important role in explaining the species difference in tool use. So to summarize what we have seen so far, we saw that ecological opportunities are important in explaining differences across populations of a tool-using species, like the chimpanzee. And second, we saw that an intrinsic predisposition for tool use was important in explaining why some species use tools and others don't. But there's of course one key species missing from these comparisons. How do we humans fit in? And what are the roles of environmental, social, and cognitive factors in explaining the difference in technology between humans and the other apes? This brings us to the final part of my talk, where I'll introduce you to our upcoming project, which includes all the African apes and humans. The Comparative Human and Ape Technology, or CHAT project, with co-PIs Cricket Sons and Dave Morgan, is the first comparative study of tool use to include all the African apes as well as humans. And second, the CHAT project is the first to compare the African apes and humans whilst keeping the environmental context as good as constant. All species reside in the Congo Basin forest. By including all the African apes and humans in the same comparative framework, we aim to shed light on the mechanisms that underlie human technology and set it apart from other species. Now, the diversity of tool-using skills across the African plate provides a natural opportunity to implement a comparative approach to investigate how technology evolved. Chimpanzees use a variety of tools across contexts. Bonobos use few tools and none in foraging, and gorillas are generally considered non-tool users. Now, in addition, we'll take a developmental perspective to investigate the differences in tool use between humans and African apes. We will compare tool-use development across humans and apes and link ontogenetic trajectories to ecological and social developmental inputs. The chat project includes chimpanzees, gorillas, and Benjela-Bayaka hunter-gatherers in the Republic of Congo, and bonobos in neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo, all within the Congo Basin Forest. The chat project uses a comparative approach. First, comparative research in a natural, ecological, and social setting is crucial for determining the factors which prompt differences in technology to emerge among humans and apes. And second, including both apes and humans in the same comparative framework is essential to investigate to what extent apes and humans share traits that underlie tool use. The chat project combines a comparative with a developmental approach. First, ontogenetic stages are often given less attention than adult forms, even though small changes in developmental trajectories can have huge effects on adult phenotypes. And surprisingly, studies comparing tool use development in humans and apes are virtually non-existent. Second, developmental research often compares individuals across age classes rather than following an individual's development over time. Such individual level longitudinal studies are needed to link ontogenetic trajectories to the ecological and social developmental inputs. So here's our three-factor model again. In the chat project, we will build on previous research by investigating the roles of the environment, sociality, and cognition. And in addition, we'll now add the ontogenetic background on which the development of tool use takes place. Before wrapping up, I'll give you a glimpse of some of the first findings coming in from our gorilla pilot study looking at object manipulation. Now, we had no idea whether these non-tool using apes would do anything with objects at all. So we were very excited to find that, in fact, young gorillas do all sorts of things with objects. They explore them, they carry them, they throw them, they break them, they bite them, and they also play with them. And most interestingly, they even seem to use them as what you might call tools. Let's have a look. Here we see Cow, a young gorilla who is keen to play with the silverback called Loya on the left. And as you can see, Cow uses a leafy twig to invite the silverback to play with him, and successfully so. So depending on your definition, this could qualify as social tool use. Now, of course, these are still preliminary observations, and the next steps will involve collecting more data and comparing the patterns of object manipulation across species. So to sum up, the chat project uses a comparative developmental approach to examine the evolution of tool use across the African apes and humans. This approach is integrated with the explicit testing of both ecological and socio-cognitive hypotheses. The ecological hypotheses include the necessity and opportunity hypotheses, about which you heard a lot earlier, as well as the relative profitability hypothesis, which looks at the energetics of tool use. Then the socio-cognitive hypotheses include the exploratory tendency hypothesis. Remember the chimp-bonobo difference in object manipulation. The social learning hypothesis, which looks at the role of learning mechanisms. And the cultural intelligence hypothesis, which considers social learning opportunities. Now, ecological and social-cognitive drivers likely both played a role in the evolution of technology in primates. However, past research has not assessed ecological and social-cognitive factors for tool use in the same study, rarely considering more than a single primate species and often excluding humans from these comparisons based on the assumption that comparable data could not be generated. So we propose the Comparative Sociological and Developmental Approach, or CSDA, to identify the specific factors that have influenced the evolution of tool use, not only in apes, but across primate species, and including humans. Such an integrated framework is crucial to understanding the processes shaping variation in technology across species, both during development and across evolutionary time. This integrated approach can help advance our understanding of the adaptive qualities of tool use, as well as the selective pressures associated with the evolution of primate tool use. And understanding tool use as an adaptation is essential for identifying factors which have prompted tool use across a range of primates and promoted the flourishing of technology in our own lineage. So before finishing, I would like to thank many people in many places, students and research assistants for their invaluable help in the field, many collaborators and colleagues for their support, and a list of funding bodies for their financial contributions. And I'd like to thank you very much for listening and for your attention.
Thank you, Kat. Amazing talk. Exciting, broad-ranging, ambitious, beautifully illustrated, and enormous amounts of food for thought. Can I invite some questions either through the chat, preferably, or through frantic waving if nothing else seems to be working? Laurie and I will be keeping a close eye on the chat. Anyone like to open up? Amelie, straight in.
Yes, well, thank you, Kat, for your presentation. It was great. So I was wondering, because apparently there are some, there is one archaeological site for chimpanzees in Côte d'Ivoire. So I was wondering if you could kind of compare the tool use that in modern chimpanzees and the tools from that archaeological site, and if you could see any differences or any kind of evolutionary patterns.
Yeah, this is a great site in Thai forest in Ivory Coast, where the chimpanzees today still crack nuts. And what we're seeing is that so these tools that they dug up, they were about 4,000 years old, I think. And as far as I know, they look really quite similar to what we see today. So seemingly not all that much has changed over this time. I don't know if they've done more analysis really looking at more specific characteristics of the tools, but I think on first glance, it looks very much like a nut cracking site from the chimpanzees as we see today.
Thank you.
Rob, I think you have a question lined up and ready.
Yes. Thank you, Kat. That's absolutely fascinating. And the bit that always fascinates me is obviously the bonobo Pan-troglodytes contrast, which is so striking for two such similar species. And looking at your data, I mean, you could make a case that there's some sort of trade-off going on between practical competence, we call it that, technology, and social intelligence. And I just wondered, why should that, I mean, do you think that is the right hypothesis? And if so, I mean, why should that be the case? Because it's not necessarily, unless we go down the kind of systematizing, EQ type of models of Simon Baron-Cohen, which are unlikely to apply to chimpanzees.
So I think there might indeed be some kind of trade-off, but and that's what I want to look more into with that exploratory tendency hypothesis. It might be that it's more an interest or motivational trade-off. Because also if we look at eye tracking studies on chimpanzees and bonobos, we see that bonobos are very much paying attention to the eyes, social. They're really interested in what somebody's doing. Whereas a chimpanzee is paying much more attention to the object involved into whatever that individual is doing. So there seems to be a difference in interest, which also comes across in my data on object manipulation. So I don't think bonobos indeed are cognitively limited and are not able to, but they might simply be more interested in the social stuff. So we're now planning a very cool project in a sanctuary, bonobo sanctuary, where the bonobos use tools, they crack nuts, they do all sorts of things. And we want to look at trying to tease apart these different explanations, because there we have more controlled setting where we can look at interest in objects versus social stuff versus opportunities from learning from others. So yeah, trade-off, I think maybe more about motivation and interest than really about cognition as such, or cognitive capacity.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question from John typed up here, but it'll come much better if you deliver it in his own inimitable way. Over to you, John.
Oh, thanks, Kat. Brilliant talk. Wonderful. Just what you need in late November. Quick question. You were saying that you think chimps use tools and bonobos don't because baby chimps play with things and baby bonobos don't. But could it be the other way around then? Baby chimps play with things because when grown up, they will need to use tools? How do you figure out the causation?
Yeah, very tricky and very good question, of course. So I think if you look at an evolutionary skill, maybe at some point in time, there might have been a situation where chimpanzees moved out of their forested habitat, at least at some places, whereas the bonobos always stayed in this Congo Basin rainforest. So it might be that at that point there was selection for those individuals that could use tools, perhaps adapted better to certain changing environments. And then there might be some kind of Baldwin effect, some kind of gene culture co-evolution, that if you are more interested in objects and do more object manipulation, you might be better at learning how to use tools, and you might survive better, etc. So then this kind of object manipulation tendency or motivation gets locked in. So I think it's really like chicken and egg, like where, how, what, when, but that would be my best guess.
Other questions? While we're waiting, you dangled right at the end this very tantalizing possibility with the gorillas. Could we invite you to expand on that? And did I understand it right that you were suggesting that basically if we altered the way we define activities, we might be categorizing different species propensities rather differently, or where was that going?
I think that first of all, we didn't know at all what we were going to find with the gorillas. So we're very excited to see that they are doing some things with objects. Under some definitions of tool use, this inviting somebody else to play with a tool or with an object would be categorized as tool use. Under other definitions, it wouldn't be. But I think what it indicates is that there's really interesting potential in other species. Perhaps they use tools more in a social context and less for feeding, and kind of comes back to what we talked about with Rob, this different interests and different motivations. So this is super preliminary data that we're just starting to look at. So I cannot say all that much more, but just to say that they are doing some things with objects, and yeah, there might actually be something interesting there.
Thanks very much. We have a question in from David Hugh, which I think he would like to deliver himself.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask, was there any evidence of perhaps interaction between different cultures of chimpanzees, and could that have changed technology and evolved technology? Is there any studies of it? Is there any evidence of it? And could interaction with other cultures actually be a reason why some chimpanzees, if they're more interactive with other cultures, they hence have more evolution of technologies versus bonobos?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. So chimpanzees are very territorial. So if you have two neighboring communities, they won't peacefully interact. The only exchange of knowledge really is females that when they reach sexual maturity, they migrate to a neighboring or a nearby other community. And from the data, again, from the Thai forest in Ivory Coast, what we're seeing is that these females that change community seem to adapt to the local culture. So rather than really introducing a new way of doing it, they seem to change towards doing what the locals are doing, which is of course a very smart thing to do because they've lived in that particular environment the longest. Then in bonobos, again, they blow our minds. They very peacefully can interact with neighboring groups. So I've had it happen one day that I'm following my community of bonobos and I know all the individuals, and all of a sudden I look around and there are 60 bonobos and I don't know half of them because they were just hanging out with the neighboring group and they were grooming and interacting, and they might stay together for a couple of days. So again, in bonobos, there would be a lot of potential for transmission of knowledge, of cultural knowledge. And of course, the fact that they don't use tools doesn't mean that bonobos don't have culture. So a really nice study that came out last month or so showed that different communities of bonobos seem to have different hunting cultures. So this was observed at a site with a very homogeneous forest. So the prey availability was the same in the different home ranges of the bonobos. But the one community focused really on duikers, so these small forest antelopes, and the others were focusing more on the kind of squirrel type prey. So indeed, there could very much be, there are bonobo cultures, but the question is, why not more technological?
Fantastic, right. The questions are starting to pour in. Liam McLean, then Ezra Zubro, then Alessa Weiler.
Hello. This may just be a rewording of John Robb's question, but so initially it was believed that necessity was the mother of innovation. Then you found out that the opportunity also played a key role in whether new innovations were developed. And now you're finding that it also has to do with the cognitive predispositions. So that begs the question, why do the cognitive predispositions exist in the first place? So I was just wondering how you would test that, or if there is a way to test that.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, these different hypotheses are really not mutually exclusive. So I think different factors, different pressures really work together. And it might be that still necessity might sometimes also be the mother of invention. It might be that at the level of innovation, it might be that we see more exploration or innovation when energetic resources are limited, which is why in this chat project, we're still going to look into necessity and opportunity and relative profitability. And it might be that the opportunities for tool use are very important for transmitting and maintaining a culture. So it might be that necessity and opportunity kind of acting at different times at different levels. So that kind of links back to your question. It might be that the initial tool use innovations link back to a period of environmental change or necessity, which, as I explained in the answer to John Robb, might then lead to individuals that are, based on just variability, are more interested in objects, become better tool users, and et cetera, and also the individuals that are better at learning might be selected for. So you might see this culture gene co-evolution going on. So really, I don't think the question is it this or that? It's definitely working together. We're just trying to figure out what's the relative importance and when are these different aspects most have most explanation of what we see.
So can people hear me? Thank you very much for a lovely talk. My question is kind of to turn John upside down and ask the question, do we have every selection for non-technology or amongst these groups, or evolutionarily the loss of technology?
I'm having a hard time imagining what the selective pressures would be, but I think what might be the case is that you only have so much time in a day, and that you might therefore have spend more time on tool use or social interactions depending on your social and ecological setting. Because what we see from these bonobos in captivity, they can use tools, and they do use tools. And but why are they using tools and not their wild counterparts? I think that's a nice setup to test. What is it about these different settings that makes the one using tools and the others not? Is it the case that in a captive setting, even if you're not all that motivated or interested, you just have so much time that you end up tool using anyway? Or perhaps there are so many opportunities with objects and perhaps learning opportunities from the keepers that you end up tool using anyway. So I think we're trying to get at these different levels by also comparing wild and captive, where we see such a strikingly different situation.
Well, we do know that later on, of course, that sometimes the investment in technology is actually the actual investment in the creation of the technology is much less efficient than to use the more simplified technologies that groups have had. So it might be something along those lines. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you.
Alessa, I think you have the floor.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just kind of wondering, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, we can.
Okay, cool. I was just kind of wondering, you mentioned a little bit about how I think bonobos had more kind of social partners than chimpanzees, but they use less tools. And I was wondering whether you could expand a little bit on this negative relation.
I had a little bit hard time hearing exactly what you said, but I think you asked about the fact that bonobos had more social partners, but are not using foraging tools. So I think what it indicates is that if they were using foraging tools, there would be a lot of opportunity to learn from others and to spread this knowledge. And this kind of matches some experimental findings that bonobos seem to be more tolerant than chimpanzees towards conspecifics. Why they then don't use tools, yeah, I don't think that's a result of having more social partners, but having more social partners might be an effect of being more socially interested, socially motivated than technologically motivated. And whether these things are really a trade-off, I don't know. It's a hypothesis that we want to test. Perhaps we humans can have it all and they can't. I mean, it's up in the air.
Further questions, keep them coming. You've got plenty of time. And Kat, I'm sure you've got plenty of energy to respond. Any other questions out there? Sure, from Paloma, here we go.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is, it has been said that one of the main cultural traits of humans is that we have an accumulation of cultural traits, usually towards complexity, even if sometimes it is not really clear what do they mean by complexity. And I was wondering if in chimpanzees, there are evidences of accumulation of these cultural traits over time. And thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you for that question. That's a really good, I'm glad you bring that up, because indeed one of the differences that is put out there is what really makes human culture difference is this cumulative aspect, which most likely is linked to teaching and language, and chimpanzees having culture, but it not being cumulative. So you ask if there's an example at all of cumulative culture. I think the closest we get to that is the example of termite fishing tool use in Central Africa. So these chimpanzees, they use, well, first of all, they use different types of tools for different tasks. And they also have a way of fishing for termites where they make a brush tip. So the tool, they fray the end with their teeth, and that actually makes it much more efficient in fishing for termites. So that seems to be one step that has been accumulated on top of just using termite fishing tools. So I think that's the closest we're coming to an example of cumulative culture in apes.
Thank you.
Thank you. It looks as if the questions are perhaps slowing down now. So unless anyone else has anything else they're burning to ask Kat, could we thank her once again for a fantastic talk? And I would like, on behalf of all the department, to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving if you're going that way. I hope you've all got your turkey or your appropriate alternative if you're of other dietary persuasion, and happy holidays. Looking forward to the coming month. It's been great having you all following this series. It's been wonderful. I really hope you'll keep with us next year. Keep following it. A new Garrod sequence kicking off in late January. But in the meantime, thank you to Kat. Thank you to Laurie. Thank you to all those who've been presenting and keeping the flame of discussion and debate and controversy and excitement alive in Cambridge right the way through a really difficult period. So hugely appreciated and all very best. Take care all. See you soon.